is Dr. Scott Secor. I am a health service psychologist, and I am the director of Renew Counseling Center, which is a part of Southern Nazarene University. We are a community and university clinic, and I'm also a professor in our graduate programs in counseling. And I'm with you today to do what we're calling mental health minutes, which are these brief 10-minute videos that are informational to help us start to kind of understand where do people get into trouble and what are the common factors that actually cause mental health distress. And today is kind of a heavier topic. We're going to be talking about suicidality, which I'm calling a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And so we're going to talk about how we as clinicians often evaluate this, what we think about, the questions that we ask, when is someone in trouble versus when is this, semi-normal thoughts periodically. And so we're going to talk about that today. So suicidal thoughts often result from hopelessness. In fact, hopelessness is one of the key factors that often causes concern for us as clinicians related to potential suicidal behavior, okay? But some of the hopelessness comes from a helpful place. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people have suicidal thoughts because they have a desire to reduce psychological suffering. And that is something that they have in common with the therapist, is we both want to reduce psychological suffering, okay? The problem is that mutual goal is often we have different outcomes or different processes that we think to go about with it. So folks that are often struggling with suicidal thoughts have a permanent solution to how to end that suffering. And we as clinicians can offer more hope and more holistic and more long-term healthy interventions and more holistic options, okay? So one of the things that I found interesting when I was in graduate school was we did a lot of research studies on suicidal behaviors. And what was fascinating is there was a study that came out that 45% of those that actually completed suicide had made contact with a primary care physician within a month prior to their attempt, 20% within 1 day. And what that suggests is that often people are seeking help. They are reaching out, but they often do so in very subtle ways. They're very afraid of how you're going to react a lot of times. So I think what they're often afraid of is that people are going to panic, that they're going to hospitalize them, that this is something really problematic with them, and so they keep it to themselves, even if they're reaching out. And so part of what we have to do as mental health clinicians, and I think anybody that is intervening with suicidality, is to become good noticers. And what I mean is to start to notice the things that people aren't saying, but start to notice the nonverbal behaviors that suggest that someone's not quite themselves right now, and to start to actually have conversations about those things. I think sometimes we think that having a conversation about suicidal thoughts is going to push someone to do it. And I would actually say it's demystifying it. It's actually bringing it to the surface. It's making it a relational endeavor instead of a private endeavor by someone who's struggling with that, okay? So one of the things I want people to know is how common are suicidal thoughts. In my experience, they're really common. Most people throughout their lifetime will have moments when things get really difficult and what we call suicidal ideation or brief, fleeting suicidal thoughts will happen. So in my clinic, we don't hospitalize a lot of people, not because we're just ignoring it, but because we're normalizing these suicidal thoughts. And so we're starting to help people recognize that just because you have times when essentially your brain's overwhelmed and you don't know what else to do doesn't mean that you've necessarily got a significant problem, okay? And so I often just try to normalize that with people and recognize that essentially they're just trying to figure out a way to make this pain stop, okay? Unfortunately, they're thinking, again, in very black and white, permanent ways, okay? So when do I become concerned as a therapist? Well, when someone has a plan. They find that a lot of people that have rehearsed, that have come up with specific plans about how they're going to do it, and had actually started to kind of think through rehearsals of it, are more concerning because they are coming up with potential solutions. They're starting to rehearse it. And this can be very interesting things. There's been times where we've had folks that have started to cut their hair to give it away. There's been times where people have written letters and notes. There's been all sorts of behaviors that can potentially suggest that they are thinking very deeply about this. And then we're going to ask them about the means. Do they actually have means to complete the suicide attempt that they're actually pondering and contemplating? And if they do, particularly in more lethal ways, like guns are things that we are always very terrified because those are very immediate and abrupt interventions. Have they had previous attempts before? Again, might that suggest that they're rehearsing and essentially kind of like continuing to think about it in very, very problematic and obsessive ways, okay? And then we're also assessing the presence of hopelessness, okay? Sleep is very important to mental health well-being. People that are not sleeping well, that are not really getting restorative rest, can be dangerous in those ways because their minds are not thinking clearly at this particular point. And so that can be a precursor. Obviously, substance abuse, but also strong emotional reactivity. People who are impulsive are folks that make me nervous from time to time because, again, they can be very impulsive and dangerous and may not always think through. They may just react to a particular emotional stimuli and do something about it, again, in very permanent ways, okay? So again, plans, means, previous attempts, hopelessness, emotional reactivity are things that absolutely get on my radar to make me really evaluate, do we need to do extra levels of intervention for someone? Okay, so how do we intervene as therapists? Again, I said earlier we need to notice. We have to become good noticers. And one of the things that I think I really like about being a psychologist is that I am trained to notice things that probably other people don't notice. And that can be very subtle signs, okay? But when we notice those things, part of what we have to do is not panic. I think we have to be able to normalize the feelings that people are having and let them know that we want the same things that they do. We want them to stop suffering. And that may mean some heavier interventions like hospitalization, but it also may mean that we just need a space to talk about it and get it out of our heads and start to normalize that you're struggling and it's okay to struggle and start to understand the nature of the thoughts. How much are they happening? How intense are they? What means exist? And so the evaluation process still has to be relational in a lot of ways, I think, to essentially instill hope in people that this is a really tough time right now, but there is hope that this can get better. And that's what we've got to be able to kind of invoke into people. And so some of the resources that I want to share with you, obviously, is the Veterans Crisis Line, which is 1-800-273-8255. And veterans press 1, and you'll get connected with somebody with help. 988 is a great resource as well. And the other thing that we have to think about is a lot of our police officers and departments are getting officers trained in crisis intervention. They're called CIT officers. And they're getting trained more in kind of how to intervene in these situations and going through really good ways in which they can start to kind of like intervene in ways that are not reactive but are more understanding of mental health distress and are able to kind of help people kind of get access to services. And so what I'm glad to hear about that continues to happen is a lot of the communities involved in responding in these ways are continuing to find ways to understand mental health distress and provide hope and healing for those that are struggling with it, okay? So the take-homes for this Mental Health Minutes today. Suicidal thoughts are actually quite normal, but they're a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And most people who experience suicidal thoughts do reach out during times of distress, but they often reach out in very subtle ways. And we may not always get them deliberately saying, overtly saying what's going on. And so we've got to be good listeners. We've got to be good noticers. And that talking about suicidality does not promote the act of it. Rather, I would say it normalizes it. It brings those unconscious fears and those irrational thoughts to the front and brings them out into the open space and gives them air and gives them oxygen and starts to demystify them and takes the power out of them in a lot of ways. And being overwhelmed with hopelessness is powerful. We have to understand that often people are clouded in their thoughts and they're not able to see past the darkness that's going on. And what we get to do as those that intervene is to provide clarity, to provide hope that this darkness, if we can stand fast in the darkness, that light will present itself even when we don't often know, when we don't see it coming. And if we can do that, we can really help continue to prevent suicidal completions and attempts. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for listening.